over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. She opened the earth, walking with blood-soaked feet.
Well, greetings and welcome back as always. Thank you all so much for joining. So it's reported that Donald Trump urged Volodymyr Zelensky to accept Putin's terms or be destroyed by Russia. He tossed aside maps of Ukraine front line and volatile White House meeting. Zelensky and his team went to the White House hoping to persuade Trump to supply them with long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles, but the U.S. president ultimately declined to do so. Does the U.S. even have the stockpile of Tomahawks to provide to Ukraine? And what would this do to Russia's perception of its adversaries? Who then would Russia believe it was actually fighting? Well, let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events in the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. Let's quickly look at some of today's headlines. Trump beats the drums of war for direct action in Venezuela. The administration has surged warships, planes, and troops to the Caribbean for drug interdiction. Some see the ultimate goal as toppling Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. With dozens of warships and planes and thousands of U.S. troops newly deployed to the Caribbean Sea, Trump has declared an, quote, armed conflict with drug trafficking groups as he has designated, or as he has designated as international terrorists. U.S. air attacks have blown up at least 7 boats that Trump has charged were carrying drugs to the United States in international waters from Venezuela in the process of killing dozens of alleged traffickers. And one of the issues that we have to ask ourselves here is the ultimate goal of toppling President Nicolas Maduro. Who would the United States replace Maduro with? Because if we look at the American track record of regime change over, we can just say the last 25 or 30 years, the U.S. record has not been that good. What the United States has a tendency of doing is toppling leaders, creating a tremendous power vacuum, and then not being able to manage the vacuum that it has created. Look at where we are in Libya, for example. Look at where we are in Iraq, for another example. Those are just two. Look at where we are in Syria. It's, as Gil Scott-Heron would say, it's an endless list that won't be missed when at last America is purged. Russia calls out NATO and Western influence for tensions in Ukraine. Russia has called out Western nations and NATO for escalating tensions in Ukraine. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on the 21st of October, Lavrov claimed that Western nations are trying to eradicate all, quote, eradicate all things Russian, end quote, in Ukraine, including the country's language, history, and culture. Actions, it says, are being carried out by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's government. The Western agenda seeks to eradicate all things in Ukraine, all things Russian, including our language and history. It's one of the main reasons, along with efforts to draw Ukraine into NATO, that led President Putin to decide on launching the special military operation. This comes after NATO approved the proposal to supply Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, a move expected to enhance Kyiv's long-range strike capabilities. But of course, you've got to reconcile NATO's approval with the United States not approving. And finally, Trump's second meeting with President Putin canceled. The anticipated second meeting between President Trump and Russian President Putin has been canceled or has been called off, according to a senior White House official. The cancellation, a reversal of Trump's statement last week, and I think it's important to realize it was Trump's statement last week, followed Rubio's telephone conversation with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Monday. So the question is, was there really ever a meeting scheduled, or was this more wishful thinking by Trump put out into the blogosphere that the parties were trying to accommodate? On today's episode, the issue before us is what's going on with the conflict in Ukraine. Are we closer to a World War III? Are we maintaining course and speed? Is this maintenance of the status quo? Are we closer to peace? What in the world is going on? Zelensky wants Tomahawk cruise missiles. Well, folks, people in hell want ice water. But are there really missiles to send? Let's talk with my guest. He's an American, former United States Marine Corps intelligence officer, former UN Special Commission weapons instructor, author, and commentator, Scott Ritter. Scott, as always, welcome back.
Well, thanks. I hope you can hear me. I know you can't see me because my camera has decided that it is not cooperating with me today. And I apologize for that. Let me see if there's anything I can do to change this reality.
Okay. Well, while you do
that, look at that.
There you go. Who says a Marine can't put in a light bulb?
I do. The proof was in the blank screen.
Thank you, Scott, as always, for joining us. Not really sure where to start with this. Let me start. Let's go back to last Friday and to Zelensky's meeting with Donald Trump, which seemed to be, the second part or the second whipping from the first meeting. Give me, before I go into a whole bunch of questions, your overall thoughts of what transpired last Friday.
Well, last Friday was the consequences of a bluff gone bad. Donald Trump had, I think, based upon some extraordinarily bad advice, taken a position that if he acted like he was tough, threatening, to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, threatening to collapse the Russian oil market, that Putin might blink. And then Putin might be willing to accept terms that Putin had made clear in the Alaska meeting, were unacceptable. The notion of freezing the conflict. The last thing Russia is going to allow is a North Korea, South Korea type scenario to evolve. Russia has made it clear that when this war ends, the root causes of the conflict will have been resolved to Russia's favor, and that's the only way this war ends. Trump believes that somehow Russia's bluffing, that that Russia will, when subjected to certain pressures, fold like a house of cards. That wasn't the case. Zelensky, played a very big role in, facilitating this bluff. Saying all the right words about how determined he was, how Ukraine was going to stand. If you just gave us the tools we need, we could do the job. And once again, Zelensky, the actor, forgot that he was reading from a script and that this wasn't real. And Donald Trump had to school him on the fact that, based upon the 2.5-hour conversation he had with Vladimir Putin, the Russians weren't budging. They weren't bluffing. And if the United States continued to act out on the threats that they had articulated, that there would be an escalation that could get out of control very fast, to the detriment of the United States. And so he basically had to put Zelensky in his place and say, no, you're not going to get the Tomahawk. You're not going to get the toys we promised you. And I know we said we'd back you, but you're really going to have to accept the Russian terms. And that's something that Zelensky just wasn't prepared to hear.
I'm sure you hear these so-called analyses, as I do, on a lot of Western media, through a lot of Western media outlets. They love to say or ask the question, is Putin even really serious about peace? And I hear that question, and it takes me back to, I want to say it was April, right after the intervention had started, when Putin came out and said, we got a deal. He held up papers and said, we've got a deal. And then that deal got scuttled by the West. Putin has met with Joe Biden. Putin has met with Donald Trump. He's met with what's his name in France. He's met with a number of folks. And he's consistent in his demands. But the Western narrative is this guy, and I may say his demands aren't unreasonable based upon history. Real quick point. He's been lied to 3 times about peace with the Minsk agreement. And Angela Merkel has admitted publicly, I think it was also Francois Hollande, that also said, we never intended for this thing to work in the first place. So with that reality, we still keep hearing the question, well, is this guy even serious about peace? Scott Ritter.
Well, Vladimir Putin's the most serious person about peace in the international community today. He's the only one that has consistently sought peaceful outcomes. People have to go back to 2014, 2015, when I think in the Debaltsevo, I'm sure I'm butchering that name. It's a village in the Donetsk People's Republic where the Russian separatists and the Russian army had surrounded the Ukrainian army. Back then, the Ukrainian army wasn't as big as it is today, and their combat-capable forces had been surrounded, and they were going to be annihilated. That's when the president of Ukraine called Angela Merkel and said, you have to help me. And she called Vladimir Putin, and then she called Francois Hollande, and then Putin said, what do you want from me? These guys started a war. They declared an anti-terrorist operation. They're bombing Russian-speaking civilians. They're committing ethnic genocide. What do you want from me? They said, please give peace a chance. Let the Ukrainian army go, and we promise we will throw our weight behind the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords being the peace agreement that Ukraine had signed into before they violated it and began the battle that led to the Debaltsevo pocket. All the Ukrainians had to do is alter their constitution to give the Russian-speaking people full right to speak Russian, to practice their religion, to respect their heritage. They weren't asking to be separated from Ukraine. Ukraine would retain control over these territories. The Russians just wanted the right to be Russian. And they all agreed. But as you pointed out, today Angela Merkel has acknowledged, and so has Francois Hollande, and so has Petro Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, that this was just a sham to buy time so that NATO could come in and build up the Ukrainian army so that it could go back and finish the job of beating these Russian separatists. Putin has later admitted he was somewhat naive to believe these people were serious about peace. But for 8 years, Vladimir Putin singularly pursued a peaceful outcome in Ukraine. He was the only one. When he met with Joe Biden in Geneva in June of 1921, Joe Biden said, "Why are you moving troops around the border?" He said, "First of all, any troops I move are inside Russia. Second of all, we're moving them in response to Ukrainian buildup using that army you built to threaten the Russians. Tell the Ukrainians to accept Minsk, and all this goes away." And Biden promised. He said, "I will send Tony Blinken to get this job done." That was in June. In September, Blinken was in the process of shipping lethal military assistance to Ukraine because the United States had no intention of doing what the president promised. Blinken was actively facilitating the armament of Ukraine with offensive weapons. Russia confronted the British and the French and said, "Are you going to put pressure on Ukraine to implement Minsk?" And they said no. And even then, Russia didn't go to war. But then December 17th, they submitted 2 draft treaties, one to the United States, one to NATO, that said, this is what we need to bring stability. We need no NATO membership for Ukraine. Pretty much it. They said no. And even then, Russia negotiated with Ukraine up until the very end. Volodymyr Zelenskyy brags about how he led the Russians on till the very end, thinking there could be a peace agreement. No one's been serious about peace but Putin. And the SMO was initiated to do what? Not to occupy Ukraine, but to compel the Ukrainians to come to the negotiating table. 6 days after they began the special military operation, the Ukrainians did just that. 3 rounds of negotiations in Gomel, Belarus. Then they moved to Turkey, finished up in Istanbul, where that document you spoke about was held out by Vladimir Putin. Mission success. But nobody wanted peace. We injected $48 billion worth of weaponry, rebuilt the Ukrainian army, and began this conflict. Russia has always said, we're willing to end this war on those terms that we negotiated in Istanbul, as long as they reflect the present day reality. And the present day reality is that there's been referendum, and that Donbass, Donetsk, Lugansk, and then Kherson and Zaporozhye are now part of Mother Russia. And anybody who thinks that Putin can negotiate that away doesn't know a darn thing about Vladimir Putin or the Russian Constitution. The Russian president has no authority whatsoever to give up Russian territory. And so for Donald Trump or anybody to say, no, we need you to freeze the line of contact right now, and Ukraine gets to keep where Ukraine is at, and Russia gets to keep. No, that's like saying we'll give away half of California, we'll give away half of Florida. It just isn't going to happen.
This talk about tomahawks. Throughout this conflict, there's always been the next wonder weapon that's being introduced to the battlefield. It was one time it was Leopard tanks. Oh boy, when these Leopards get here, man, they're gonna change the dynamic on the battlefield. F-16. Oh, when we get these F-16s, man, that's going to change the dynamic of the battlefield. With the long-range capabilities of these missiles, and the fact that they can also carry nuclear warheads, would that be a change on the battlefield? And the second part of that question, or maybe it should be the first part of the question, do we even have them in the stockpile to send?
Well, we have, I'm sure the real number is a classified number, but it's somewhat over 4,000 of these Tomahawks in our system. Block 4, I believe Block 5 is the more modern version. These are nuclear capable weapons that have been around for a long time. In 2017, we fired Tomahawk missiles into Syria, a massive Tomahawk attack. I think some 60-odd weapons were fired in there. Most of them didn't reach their targets. They were shot down, or they just don't work. One of the still classified numbers out of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War back in 1991, is the success rate of Tomahawks in hitting their target. The U.S. Department of Defense just doesn't want that number known because it ain't a very impressive number. This isn't the great wonder weapon that everybody thinks it is. It takes a lot of tomahawks to destroy a target. But the bottom line is several of these tomahawks fell intact into Syrian farmers' fields. And the Russians received these things, and they've taken them apart. They've looked at them from every angle, and they've developed solutions to them. So the fact is, if the Ukrainians ever use tomahawks, they'd probably be shot down. As Vladimir Putin said, it's not going to change anything on the battlefield. This is not a weapon we're afraid of. The one thing is, it is nuclear capable. Therefore, we have to assume anytime a Ukrainian would fire one, that potential nuclear thing, this is an escalation, and things will get out of control really quick. But we're not worried about this, and Russia shouldn't be worried about it. It's a system they've been preparing to fight for, over 40 years now. So, it's just a political thing. You mentioned the Leopard tanks, and this is an important, reality that needs to be injected here. To get the Germans to provide the most modern version of the Leopard tank, the United States had to promise Ukraine the American Abrams tank. We had to put that on the table. And then we sort of delayed it. And we got the Germans to commit. I think this Tomahawk thing is similar. We want the Germans to be the ones who pay the price. We want them to give the Ukrainians the Taurus missile. But in order to get Germany, off the fence on this, we have to be seen as being willing to give the Tomahawk. And I believe that's what this was, a bluff the entire time. But Putin didn't blink, didn't show any concern. Basically let President Trump know that if you do provide Tomahawks to Ukrainians, our response will be appropriate and disproportionate. It's not going to be a good end for anybody. And Trump backed down. I don't think he was ever intending to deploy the Tomahawk. There were so many political and technological hurdles that needed to be crossed that weren't being crossed. But he played that card, played that hand for as long as he could. But finally, Putin called his bluff.
I want to say it was about 10 days ago or so that former Russian president, and I think he is he a defense minister, Medvedev, said, if you interject or introduce Tomahawks into the conflict, I'll paraphrase, and I think this is what he said. He said, it will be a very perilous reality for the United States, and it will be a personal perilous reality for you, Donald Trump. Then last Thursday, I think, Trump and Putin have a phone call. I think it was a 2-hour call or 2.5-hour call. They said it was the longest call the two have had. And it seems as though after that phone call, the reality shifted in the mind of Donald Trump. And he told Zelensky, hey man, get your lunch and get out. You're done. Agree to the terms or you're going to get annihilated. Do you have any insight into what might have been said? Because I can just imagine President Putin saying, Donald, I'm really getting tired of you. And you're going to force me to do some things that you really, really, really don't want to see me do. Or, you had a father who seems to be a lot like mine was. Son, it's time for you to change your tune. Scott Ritter.
Well, I mean, Vladimir Putin is very diplomatic and very measured in what he says. But it's clear, and based upon the language used by the United States and by Russia, that what they said was a frank and direct conversation. That's language that implies that things were said that the other side wasn't happy about. And I think Donald Trump probably led the conversation off saying that this is what the United States expects from Russia, or else we're going to do the following. And he probably told the Russians that, we know that you're losing this many people and your economy is about to collapse and we don't want to do bad things to you, but, you give us no choice unless you accept peace on our terms. And according to Ushakov, who's the presidential advisor, probably present at the phone call, he said that Putin reiterated the Russian reality, which is this war will end when Russia says it ends, and not 1 minute sooner. And it will end on terms acceptable to Russia. And that means all of the territories belong to Russia, and Ukraine will have to leave them or they'll be forcefully evicted. I think the Russian president also reminded the American president that whoever's giving him this advice is stupid, that Russia is not suffering the casualties he says they are, that Russia is advancing, and that Russia will continue to advance. And then at the end of the day, Russia will get what it wants. And that if this war continues, that just means more Ukrainians are going to die. And then he reminded him about the Tomahawk and said, if you do this, you're going to pay a price. I want to remind people that on September 13th of last year, the Russian ambassador, Anatoly Antonov, made a phone call to people close to the Biden administration, putting them on notice about what the consequences would be if Biden signed off on documents being brought in by Keir Starmer to authorize British, French, and American weapons to be used against Russian strategic targets inside Russia to strike the Russian strategic depth. And the bottom line is that it would be clear that Russia would respond. The response would be in accordance with their nuclear doctrine, and that Washington, D.C. would be one of the targets. And Biden backed down. I don't know if Putin was going to be that direct, but I'm pretty sure that the President of the United States was put on notice that the consequences of continuing this course of action would be unpleasant for everybody. And Medvedev made it clear that Washington, D.C. would be one of the targets. The Russians just aren't playing games anymore. They're not going to let the United States provide Ukraine with capabilities that can strike Moscow. And anybody who thinks that Ukraine can hit the Kremlin and walk away intact doesn't know about the Russians.
So, looking for off-ramps here. And obviously, to what you've just said, Russia isn't looking for an off-ramp. They're looking for an end, and on their terms. Some have said that this Budapest meeting, what was the reality behind this Budapest meeting? Because the administration wants to tell you, we were going to have this meeting. I seem to recall reading from the Russian side, what meeting? And I don't know. And then there were those that were saying that it was really Vladimir Putin that was trying to give Donald Trump some space to save face and an off-ramp. Scott Ritter.
Again, without knowing the details of the conversation, et cetera, it's hard to say, but let's just deal realistically. There's only one side flip-flopping, panicking, and doing things, policy statements, and that's the United States. It's not Russia. Russia has been consistent. So there's only one side that needs this meeting, and that's the United States. And the reason is to provide, as you said, a face-saving mechanism to help Donald Trump distance himself from the policy posturing that he's been doing based upon the advice from Marco Rubio, Scott Bessent, Keith Kellogg, and Pete Hegseth, all of whom said take a strong line against Russia, and all of whom were wrong. Russia didn't fold. And so, a meeting in Hungary would provide, a forum for a more collegial approach to be, worked out between the United States and Russia that doesn't cause the President of the United States to be humiliated. But this was always predicated on the State Department and the Russian Foreign Ministry being able to come up with an agenda. The Russians have been adamant that they don't view the Hungary meeting, the need for that as a dead issue. What the Russians have said is that it'll happen when it's ready to happen. The U.S. media is trying to spin it as, diplomacy's dead. Rubio and Lavrov can't agree on anything. Well, what they can't agree on is that the Russians aren't going to, concede to the points of Rubio. Trump is going to have to relieve Marco Rubio of the Russian portfolio. That's the bottom line. Rubio is incapable of negotiating with the Russians because Rubio is a hardline, Russophobic, pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine personality.
And he's not a diplomat.
No, he's not. So, but you don't even need a diplomat. I mean, Steve Witkoff could do it.
Okay, that was my next question. Is there anybody in the Trump sphere that could manage this?
Witkoff, because Witkoff is the one person that appears to be able to speak directly to Trump and take Trump's words and act on. Witkoff's not going to give you the elegant solution. He's not master, diplomat, etc. But what Witkoff will be able to do is communicate clearly between the Russian side and the American side, carry the message back and forth without any filters of prejudice, kind of filters that prevent Rubio from doing this job, etc. The fact of the matter is, though, that Trump has to clear out the Oval Office from the naysayers. He really needs to send Keith Kellogg into retirement, never to be heard of from again. He needs to tell Marco Rubio focus on Venezuela. He needs to tell Pete Hegseth to do something else. That the Russia portfolio is his and his alone, and then he also needs to go. Right now, the Europeans think you're going to come to Washington D.C. and school Donald Trump, and Donald Trump needs to school them in very harsh terms about the realities. That if Europe wants to play games, the United States will unplug from Europe quicker than you can blink an eye.
Well, in fact, that was my next question. Where are the Europeans? No, not where are they? We know where they are. Why are they continuing down this dead end, very, very perilous path, especially when there seems to be such a large disconnect between the European people and the European political elite?
Politics. The European political elite, the economic political elite, have boxed themselves into a corner. They are dependent upon the concept of Russia as a threat, unquestioned support for Ukraine, and that all is predicated on the notion that the United States will stay the course and will back them up. They've done this game before. Remember when Donald Trump came in 2000, after the 2016 election, everybody was told that Trump was going to withdraw from NATO and it was going to be bad for Europe. But the Europeans were able to play him along for 4 years and keep the United States in NATO. Right now, the Europeans are saying all we have to do is buy time until early next year. And then the politics of the midterm elections kick in. And if Donald Trump hasn't decisively distanced himself from the Ukraine conflict, Ukraine policy, then politics dictate that he's going to have to stay the course because to change horses that close to the finish line, the midterm finish line, is unadvisable. So the Europeans are going to come here and try and muddy the waters, try and play to Donald Trump's insecurities and just extend this window of chaos because this chaos actually benefits Europe right now because it avoids a decision to be made about Ukraine. But I think Donald Trump is probably going to disappoint them by being, for once in his life, decisive about an issue, which is the United States. He needs this Ukraine conflict to be resolved before midterm elections come rolling in.
There are a number of stories as reported out after Friday's meeting that Trump is done with Zelensky. Your thoughts on that? And if so, what does that mean? I mean, now I've seen, we remember when the United States got done with Gaddafi, that didn't bode well for Gaddafi. When the United States was done with what's his name in Iraq, Saddam, that didn't bode well for Saddam. And we know, Kissinger's the line that is attributed to Kissinger, it's dangerous to be an American enemy. It's deadly to be an American ally. So your thoughts on these reports that Zelensky's done, how much credibility do you put in that? How much stake do you put in that? And if so, what does that mean?
Well, first of all, we have to be careful. We can't say that Zelensky's done with the American government because Donald Trump isn't the American government.
Mm-hmm.
We know that within Donald Trump's inner circle, there's many people who support Zelensky. Marco Rubio supports Zelensky. Pete Hegseth supports Zelensky. Scott Bessent supports Zelensky. Keith Kellogg supports Zelensky. The majority of Congress apparently continues to support Zelensky. The mainstream media is sympathetic to Zelensky. So how is America done with Zelensky? Donald Trump may be done with Zelensky, but that's the problem because he doesn't speak for all these other people. And if Trump dumps Zelensky precipitously without, getting other players to come along, he exposes himself politically. And I think Zelensky understands this. Zelensky has been briefed by everybody about this reality, and he's going to play this card to the hilt. He's going to basically, I believe, he's not going to cave in. He's going to continue to speak out strongly, and he's doing it in the hopes that Donald Trump doesn't have the courage it takes to actually pull the plug on Ukraine. That Donald Trump, who has never showed political courage ever.
Mm-hmm.
When push comes to shove, Donald Trump always backs down. Anytime he appears to stand up, it's just a perception of standing up. I bombed Iran. Well, only after you pre-cleared it with the Iranians and was part of a pre-negotiated deal to end the 12-day conflict. You didn't bomb Iran because you're a tough guy. You bombed Iran because Netanyahu was begging you to end the war. Every time Donald Trump stands up and looks tough, it's always done in an atmosphere where he's hyping it up, but the reality is far different. I'll believe Donald Trump is done with Zelensky when we stop sending any money, when we stop allowing anybody else to send money, when we impose sanctions on Ukraine, when we kill the guy. But until then, the United States is backing Zelensky. It's Donald Trump that's in the minority.
We heard reports yesterday about an escalation in attacks, Russia attacking a town, I can't remember the name of it, in Ukraine. Are my perceptions that President Putin is turning up the heat, are those perceptions real, or is this more a matter of how these stories are being reported?
No, the Russians have a strategic air campaign underway, which is designed to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Ukraine has been striking Russian energy targets. They escalated last night. They fired a whole bunch of their newer weapons at Russian energy targets, and Russia said, "Okay, we can play this game too." And they shut down Kiev, they shut down Kharkov, they shut down Sumy, Chernihiv. They're blowing things up left and right. And Russia will sustain this. It's interesting, they had a member of the Ukrainian parliament come out. Zelensky has been coached by the British to be seen as, I'm decisive, I'm staying the course. All I need is continued support to win. And he had bragged about how Ukraine was going to build 3,000 of these new Flamingo, cruise missiles and all that. And then the member of parliament came out and said, there ain't no 3,000 missiles. We don't have the ability to build them. We're building them by ones and twos. And they fired some last night. All they did is get the Russians angrier. So Russia, upped the number of missiles that it fired. They fired an unprecedented number of the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. They're firing drones during daytime. They've eviscerated Ukrainian air defense, and they're just going to keep doing this. It's over for Ukraine. People don't understand it, but Ukraine can't stand toe to toe. This is like getting into the ring with Mike Tyson and throwing that first punch and hitting him, thinking, I'm going to win this game. No, you just open yourself up to a world of pain, because Tyson's going to stand there and just start pummeling you, and you ain't got nothing left to give. And that's what's happening to Ukraine right now. They picked a strategic fight that they're not capable of sustaining, and they're absolutely incapable of winning.
Let's switch regions, but I think there are some dots to connect. Trump says China doesn't want to invade Taiwan. He said Monday that he doesn't think China wants to invade Taiwan and expressed optimism about reaching a trade deal with Beijing despite his recent threat to increase tariffs. The dot that I saw to connect was he tells Zelensky, you just might as well go along with the plan, or you're about to get eviscerated. So that's contrary to the dominant narrative. And now he says, oh, China doesn't want to invade Taiwan. That's counter to the dominant narrative. Is this as I think Hugo Chavez said about George H.W., he's as dangerous as a monkey with a razor blade? I mean, is this a guy that just really is saying anything, thinking that it might have some impact somewhere? I mean, your thoughts?
I think Donald Trump is a situational actor, meaning that I don't believe he's a strategic thinker. I don't think that he says, okay, how do I balance what I'm saying in Russia about Ukraine and Zelensky with Taiwan and China? And
those two things are not related.
In his brain, he's not linking those. What's happened, though, the one thing that is linking is that he's been briefed by Secretary Hegseth that the reality of modern warfare, as dictated by the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, is that the United States needs to husband its resources carefully, because if we are to go to war against a China-like target, we don't have the capacity to sustain that conflict. And so now, having been told by the Defense or the Secretary of War now that we can't win a war with China, Trump, knowing that if you say, well, China's going to invade Taiwan, therefore we have to posture accordingly, that would require Taiwan to receive missiles and things that the United States needs because our coffers, our arsenals are depleted. So Donald Trump just spins it. China's not going to invade Taiwan. It's not a big deal. But to show you the inconsistency of that, he just met with the Australian Prime Minister Albanese,
right,
where he is promoting what they call the AUKUS, Australian, UK, US, alliance, and what that hinges on, Australia gaining access to minimum three, possibly up to 5 Virginia-class submarines. This is the modern nuclear attack submarine. And in order to justify this expense, of course, you have to beef up China as a threat. So China's not going to invade Taiwan, but China's a threat worthy of, getting Australia to pony up, billions of dollars for this attack submarine. And Trump said, Albanese, don't worry about it. We're with you. We need you to work with us to build this solid front against the Chinese. And the Australians stupidly nodded their head. They don't look at the details. The Virginia-class submarine program is woefully behind schedule, 420 days behind schedule. The Australians are supposed to receive their first sub in 2032. That schedule's not going to meet, because to meet that schedule, the shipyards in America have to be able to produce 2.3 Virginia-class submarines per year. Right now, we can produce 1.2, and the trend is going in the wrong direction. By law, we can't give Australia these submarines unless we've staffed up our capabilities fully, and at 1.2, we're not going to be able to do that. So Trump is, once again, saying things, this is like with the Tomahawk or other things, where he's promising systems, but we can't deliver. We're unable to deliver. So oftentimes his rhetoric is put out there because he knows that he's never going to be able to act on it. He just wanted to do this to get Australia to do what was important to him, sign a rare earth mineral deal. You see, but Australia may not have signed that rare earth mineral deal if Trump had said, we're hesitating on this Virginia-class submarine thing. Trump said, no, we're in. We're going to do this. We're all there. I was, okay, I'll sign that rare earth mineral deal, which helps divert Australia's lithium, cobalt, and zinc capabilities to America to help, lessen the blow that we felt when China just passed a law that said we're restricting the supply of these rare earth minerals to international markets. If China stays the course on this, it's going to shut everything down, because no advanced technology in the world and in the United States can function without access to Chinese rare earth minerals. So this is, again, Donald Trump just playing situational cards that have nothing to do with a larger game. Each game is its own separate game.
Jordan H says, guys, what about the strikes in Romania and Hungary? And it's been reported Hungarian, Romanian oil refineries tied to Russia hit by blasts. Your answer to Jordan's question.
Was it qui bono? Is that the
qui bono? Who benefits?
It's always dangerous to have a Marine speaking Latin, but but who benefits? Well, Russia doesn't benefit. Hungary doesn't benefit. Romania doesn't benefit. Ukraine benefits. And I will bet a dime to a dollar that this was done by Ukrainian intelligence. That this is a provocation to bully and punish both Hungary and Romania for continuing to have economic ties with Russian energy assets.
You and I have been talking about this Ukrainian conflict for a long damn time. And all that seems to be happening here is the further devastation of Ukraine. So do you have any projection? I'm not going to ask you, when do you think this is going to end? I'm not.
3 days. 3 days, George. 3 days. The Russian army is going to be in Kiev. 3 days. I'm telling you right now. Take it to the bank. No one's. Okay. No one's going to make those predictions anymore.
Well, because didn't Trump tell us he could end it in a day?
A day, then a week, then a month, and then he can end it with a phone call. Yeah.
But with you have a very unique experience and skill set, having negotiated missile treaties with Russians. So you have, and you display it quite adeptly, insight into their thought process. So understanding their thought process and comparing that to what appears to be our lack of thought process, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, this entire conflict has been, a PhD level, research into, conflict management, conflict resolution,
or mismanagement
by some sides. But I will say that from the Russian perspective, let's put it this way. Before this conflict started, we had certain expectations of the Russian military. And it was based on doctrine and what Russia would do in a time of war.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people like myself, like the director of the CIA, like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, what would happen if Russia went to war against Ukraine? The answer is, well, Russia will destroy the Ukrainian army and the war will be over in a week. Because the Ukrainian army can't stand toe-to-toe with the Russians if the Russians come in with everything they have. And then we watched in frustration because we had made a prediction based upon certain things. And suddenly we said, well, that's not what the Russians are doing. Why aren't they doing it then? Why are they going in with so few troops? Why are they, advancing fast here, but holding here, doing it? The answer is because it wasn't a war. It was a special military operation. And when that term first came out, everybody, including myself, went, what just sounds like sort of a propaganda spin on things.
Mm-hmm.
But then we got schooled. And, this is where I have to admit, I had certain fundamental understandings about Russia that didn't apply. When the Russian government speaks, the Russian government means what it says. And this was a special military operation, not war. It wasn't designed to occupy Ukrainian terrain. It wasn't designed to decapitate the Ukrainian leadership. It was designed to create the perception of that capability so that Ukraine would go to the negotiating table. And that's what Russia wanted. And the proof in this is the Istanbul communique that was ready to be implemented by the end of March. The proof is Russia didn't want any territory. They weren't invading. They were going to withdraw from it. In fact, they began withdrawing. Withdrew from around Kiev, Chernihiv, parts of Kharkov. And they thought for sure that that this was a goodwill gesture and the Ukrainians would see it as such. They didn't realize that NATO was going to inject $48 billion worth of material, training, rebuild. The other thing people don't realize is that the Ukrainian army got its butt kicked at the beginning of the conflict. It was ripped apart. It was finished. It was done. And yet we rebuilt it. And then they attacked in the fall of 2022. And they caught the Russians while the Russians were withdrawing. It was like, why are they going through so fast? Half of the First Guards tank army had already been withdrawn back to Russia. There were huge gaps in the line because the Russians weren't ready to fight, a major war against division-sized elements bursting through. Russia consolidated, built a defensive line, stopped the Ukrainians, and ever since then it's been a war of attrition. And this is where it gets frustrating. See, Russia has rightfully diagnosed this conflict, especially after the $48 billion were injected, as not being a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but a conflict between Russia and the collective West, including the United States. Russia realized that if it engaged in a big arrow war, the Ukraine had resource depth that would outmatch Russia. If you got into where Russia is going to do the normal 3-to-1 casualty ratio when you attack for successful attacks, Russia would be outstripped. Russia had to go into a controlled attritional warfare model where, look, a guy from the State Department just came in with a number that I agree with. I've been saying, so I didn't go quite this high, but he ran the Russian-Ukrainian conflict 36-to-1 casualty ratio. I've been saying 12-to-1 up to 20-to-1. He's saying, no, it's 36-to-1 casualty ratio in favor of Russia. For every Russian loss, 36 Ukrainians. And it applies to other technologies as well. You've been lied to by the mainstream media grotesquely. Ukraine has been burning through NATO equipment like you wouldn't believe. It just, they bring it in, it gets burned through. They no longer has equipment. Ukraine is running out of men. Russia has lots of men, and the Russian defense industry is outpacing the entire West. All the lies. Russia's run out of tanks. Russia's building more tanks a month than NATO builds in a year. This is just the reality of the situation. Russia is doing this not based upon a calendar-driven schedule, but objective-driven schedule. And this is what I have had to come to realize, because I'm one of these, I'm a Marine. I was trained about maneuver warfare, big arrow warfare, and all this stuff. So every time I look at a map, I'm thinking, oh, man, if you did this, if you did this, if you did that, yeah, if you're willing to take 3-to-1 casualties, and therefore draw down your resources while NATO and the United States keep pouring in resources, that's not what the Russians did. The Russians have been very good at letting the Ukrainians fall into traps. Kursk, was it easy for Russia to have a Ukrainian force go into historic Mother Russia? No. But 80,000 dead Ukrainians later, it was is what the Russians did. I just had dinner. I just got back from Russia, and I had dinner with Ate Aladino, who is the commander of the Akhmat Special Forces. His unit was sent to Kursk to is the initial response to the incursion. And he said, yeah, these were the best. This is a core-sized unit from Ukraine, trained to the best NATO standards with the best NATO equipment, with the most modern NATO equipment, using satellites and AI and the whole thing. And he said, we came in there and we had to figure this out. We had to learn, and then we learned, and then we stabilized, and then we killed them all, and then we drove them out. It wasn't calendar driven. They weren't told you have to liberate Kursk by this date. They were told just to liberate Kursk and kill the Ukrainians, which they did. 76,000. Everybody's talking about. Do you remember the because the North Koreans actually intervened here and a number of troops. And you had everybody saying, human wave assaults, North Korean human wave assaults. They've lost 3,000 to 10,000 guys. They lost 110. That's 110 dead men. That's not an insignificant number. But do you understand that what's happening here, the inflated casualty rates.
Yes.
And that's the same thing with the Russians. The Russians have lost casualties. There's no doubt about it. But they're not anywhere along the line with the Ukrainians. Every day, when you read the Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainians are losing between 2,000 to 3,000 men a day. And that means that the Russians are losing about 150. That's a lot. I'm not going to sit here.
Right.
I mean, that's 150 mothers that lost their sons.
Right.
The difference between 150 and 3,000 is orders of magnitude.
Right.
The Russians can keep this fight up. Ukrainians can't keep this fight up. The Russians aren't losing their equipment. Again, the war's changed. It's a drone war, and the Russians have mastered it. And again, talking to Abdi Aladanov just about the reality of drone warfare, I didn't understand it. I mean, it just blew my mind because it goes against everything I was trained.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that's the way the war is done, which means you're not going to be doing big arrows anymore, as Opti likes to do. Do this, and this is what they're doing. And then when the Ukrainians send in enough people, they stop. Opti said, "We have never given up a defended point. We have never given up a defended point. Any notion that the Ukrainians have knocked us out, pushed us back, is an absolute lie. We have never given up a defended point, and we win every battle we fight." And that seems to be the reality.
Wow. Wow. Scott Ritter, as always, thank you so much for your time, Scott. Greatly appreciate that analysis. And, folks, you might, some of you say, well, Wilmer, some of the questions you've asked or some of the things you've said, you've said before. Well, I think they bear repeating because the narrative isn't changing. And I'm trying to lay a sensible predicate for analysis. So sometimes you got to go back and start at the beginning so that the current reality makes sense. And hopefully I did that. And thank you for tolerating me, Scott Ritter. I greatly appreciate it.
No, I always enjoy these conversations, and I think that the product that's produced through these conversations is a very valuable product for your audience.
Thanks, man. Thank you. I appreciate that. Hope all is well with the family, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Folks, again, I want to thank Scott Ritter for joining us today. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. Professor Dan Kovalik is going to join us. Dan Kovalik is going to join us tomorrow. So definitely looking forward to that. Please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show. Again, I think the analysis that you all got today from Scott Ritter is second to none and is a very clear reflect. I mean, when he's able to tell you, I just got back from Russia, I met with these officials, and again, there's something known as military math, and Scott over the years has demonstrated to me that he understands military math and calculus. When you say that the kill rate is 36 to 1, for every one of mine I lose, I take 36 of them with me. That's an unsustainable ratio, as Scott pointed out. And so you just have to ask yourselves, how much longer do you want this whipping to go? Joe Biden never should have started this mess, and B, Donald Trump should have stuck to his promise and ended it in a day. Because for as crazy as that sounds, he could have done that. And here's what I think at the end of all of this we're going to find. When it does finally end, they're going to get exactly what they asked for. They're going to get exactly the security guarantees that they demanded. Everything that they've been saying throughout this process, because I keep going back to this because I think it's very important. They haven't changed their demands. We keep hearing through the Western narrative, Putin doesn't want peace, and he's inconsistent. No. I don't say this because look, I'm not a political analyst. I'm not a political operative. I am not a political operative. I'm a political scientist. And I'm just looking at the data. And I'm talking to the people that know. And I have some understanding of the history. And so when you have an understanding of the history, then what you're being told in the mainstream makes absolutely no sense. So again, with all of that, Dan Kovalik is going to join us tomorrow. Follow us on social media. All the links are below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Professor Dan Kovalik is going to join us. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Peace. Have a blessed remainder of your day. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.